I call this persona non grata. According to the Buddhist view, our personality, or what we call our self, is nothing more than a composite image, kind of a montage of attachments. Principally all our personal likes and dislikes, prejudices and biases and stuff like that. I mean, it's right there in the word persona. If I would just read in the dictionary, it's often defined as a social facade or mask. But masking what? And of course I have to know what's behind the mask. I sometimes think that the mask of personality, our self-image, is like those old view cameras where the photographer holds up a little stuffed bird and calls out, "Watch the birdie," while he snaps away. Anyway, that's what we seem to do with the self. We focus on the personality, or our self-image, or of another person, of the self-image surrounding a person, rather than what is inside or behind that image. In other words, we see the cover and not the book. And what is inside? While we may gradually get over our own self, as in, get over yourself, we socially watch each other's selves twist and turn with what seems like, on our part, rapt attention. It's no wonder that cocktail parties were often so barren of depth for me. Not that I have, been to a cocktail party for maybe 40 years. Anyway, at those parties we seldom ever look beyond the veneer, much less behind the mask. Or is it with the self that is there no wizard behind the curtain? I think that's the real truth. There's no wizard behind the curtain of the self, unless we go behind it, as Hagel points out. And the Buddhists don't claim that there is no self-image, or that the self is not real. That's a misunderstanding. But rather, they say that simply that the image, the self-image, is not permanent, but changes with our wandering interests. The bottom line here is that the self is not an entity, and certainly not who we actually are. It may serve as our front man, who we think or wish we are, how we put on an appearance, a facade. Perhaps the self is what we show or make socially visible so that others can see, make it visible, to the outside world. But it indeed is some kind of mask or facade, just as the dictionary points out. And we can learn to see through the mask of the self, the persona, both in the sense that with mind practice, it becomes more transparent to us, less important, and also in the sense that we can easily mistake it, ourself, for the vantage point or peephole through which we view our entire life. We think of it, it's all tied up in ourself. It's this second meaning that most fascinates me in this particular blog, the idea that we adopt this montage that we ourselves have collected around us, this persona, this mask, not only as something to show others and to be seen by ourselves like in a mirror or in the world, but also, mistakenly, I believe, we assume it's a vantage point from which we view the world, representing the entity that we like to think we are. And talk about science fiction. It's no wonder that many of us fear death, because deep down we must instinctively know that when we leave this world, the self that we cherish and all of its various components will not be traveling with us, but the clinging and attachment, self-attachment that goes with us is going to be left behind. And as I mentioned earlier, in my opinion, Western philosophy got closest to looking at the self-concept when Hegel wrote in his major work, Phenomenology of the Mind, this one sentence. And he says, and I quote, "We go behind the curtain of the self to see what's there, but mainly for there to be something to be seen," end quote. To me, that's pure Buddhism speaking. And who is the we? And we also are surrounded by other selves doing just the same. And this is never more apparent than at social gatherings, especially stuffy ones, where all we see and all we show is the veneer that we've painted on our personal masks. As for me, give me one-to-one sit-down communication any day. The Buddhists are spot on in telling us that these social masks, these selves, this veneer that we wear, this facade, are not entities and have no permanent existence in themselves. But like the layers of an onion, they have no actual core. But don't stop there, because that's only half the story, only half of what the Buddhists are pointing out here. The other half is that we each have, beyond our mask, what's called, the Tibetans call Buddha nature, and that the personal self that we cling to is nothing more than a mind that does not yet know that each of us are a Buddha in waiting, a fully enlightened mind waiting to be discovered by our own self, by us. And the Buddhist view is not similar, it's not Platonic, in that we want, as Plato says, we once upon a time were enlightened, but somehow fell into our current obscurations, often called original sin. The Buddhists don't follow that. They don't really have any kind of cosmogenesis. And I have been very, very careful to ask the Tibetan Rinpoches about just this concept. In their view, it's not that we ever originally fell from grace and are now somehow trying to recover that state, fallen. They say that we, you and I, have simply been ignoring the true nature of our mind, call it our inner nature or whatever, for all eternity up till now, this present moment. In fact, my teacher says that we are the stragglers, the ones who in all the time there has been up to the present never have managed to get it. He actually said that we are, and I quote, the hard cases, unquote. What about that? So the bottom line here, at least for me, is this whole concept of transmigration. And I'm not talking about transmigration as in death, dying, the bardo, and rebirth, although there certainly is a parallel there. Instead, I'm talking about the transmigration of view here in our life right now, and in particular, are starting to do the homework needed to vacate our belief that the ordinary self that we cling to is some kind of viable vantage point to experience life and to exit life with. Much less solid grounds for any future lives. The Buddhists emphatically tell us that it is not true, and that the self as we know it, and the self as we love it, is going to be jettisoned, left down the road when we die. So it's best to be packing out of there now as soon as we can. Or as the Christians might say, we can go to meet our Maker. We would do well to gradually transmigrate from the view of ourselves as the self, the thinking that we are the self, to beginning to identify with the awareness and the clarity of mind beyond the self. Now, I understand that perhaps this concept of not depending on the self that I'm writing about here probably reads a bit heady or theoretical to many of you. But trust me, it's worth a serious second look by all of us. This process of gradually moving our vantage point away from self-dependency is what much of meditation and mind training practice is all about. And this self-exodus that I'm pointing at here was, that we need to do, those of us living in the West, was taken long, long ago already by the Buddhists. So we're in good company. All we have to do is follow the breadcrumb trail or method that Buddha left, which is called the Dharma.